Welcome, everybody, on this slightly cold, slightly wet Thursday night, but we're thrilled to have you with us. Welcome to the John Dunlop Memorial Lecture. We really have an exciting evening for everybody. So I'm Sharon Block, professor here at Harvard Law School and the executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy, which is the proud home of the Harvard Trade Union Program. Yes. We always have our Dunlop lecture during the HTUP, and we're excited to keep that tradition going tonight. I am now going to turn it over to my very good friend and a former director of the Harvard Trade Union Program. I won't embarrass it by saying how many years ago that was. Um, but we are thrilled always to welcome an old and good friend of the Harvard Trade Union Program, Professor David Weil.
Thank you, Sharon. I don't know about the old part, but everything else, appreciate. Good evening. It's always my happy task to say a few words about John Dunlop, who this lecture is named for, and fewer and fewer people have had the good fortune of having known John, who passed away in 2003. I had the good fortune to meet and work with, have him as my mentor fairly late in his life, and serve what, for reasons I'll explain, was an apprenticeship with John that many of us had in his life. I know that Sharon will be introducing our distinguished speaker, Daron Acemoglu, in a few moments, but I believe that John would have been delighted to have the chosen lecturer for this evening, such a distinguished academic, obviously as recognized by the Nobel Prize, among other many awards and recognition. But I think what John would have been particularly happy about is the fact that Professor Acemoglu has addressed some of the most fundamental questions of inequality in this world in a way that has actually helped the world of practice. John was an economics faculty member here at Harvard, starting in 1938. The story is that he got tenure here when he wrote an article critiquing part of John Maynard Keynes's famed book about actually wage stickiness, and John corrected him, and Keynes not only agreed, but actually wrote a letter in the Journal of Political Economy actually acknowledging John's correction. He was the Lamont University professor here at Harvard from 1938 until he passed away in 2003. He served as the chair of the economics department. He was the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences from 1969 to 1973, which was a pretty volatile moment in US and Harvard history. Important to many of us who are here as students, faculty, and staff, he was one of the two founders of the Harvard Trade Union Program in 1942 because of his belief that trade union leaders, like business leaders and government leaders, needed access to the latest research, ideas, and work that was coming out of academia. He was a leading scholar on labor markets, labor policy, industrial relations. He coined the term industrial relations systems, studying wage determination, particularly in the union sector, and had, of course, many articles and books to his name. But that's really only the academic side of John and only one part of why we honor him tonight. It's difficult to summarize John's many activities in what he would call the real world, but he had a unique ability to traverse the real world and the academic world. He served under every president from Franklin Roosevelt until Bill Clinton, with the exception of Ronald Reagan. He was known for his role in problem solving. He loved to solve complicated multi-party problems for business, labor, regarding wages and prices, regarding all kinds of different types of disputes. He brought collective bargaining to the agricultural sector through a very unique arrangement involving H-2A workers in the state with least union density in this country, North Carolina, and many other things. He worked in the construction industry, which is why many of us regard our time with John as part of an apprenticeship, and I could go on and on. Here at Harvard, he worked with Chris Rondo to write one of the most innovative collective bargaining agreements, then covering an academic institution. And in that work and in so many works, he built institutions, and he built them both inside and outside of Harvard. And again, one of the oldest is the Harvard Trade Union Program, which is the second oldest executive program here at Harvard. John, for those of us who knew him, did not suffer fools easily. He was not always the most easy person to deal with. But that's because he believed passionately in the kinds of things that, again, this lecture celebrates. I'm not sure what John would have made of the world at this perilous moment we find ourselves in. He was a believer that if you could bring people together and establish a common, what he called fact base, you could find new and innovative ways to solve things, and that government played a critical role in doing that work. Something we are sadly moving quickly away from. But as we witness the attack on many of our most basic institutions that seek to address problems of work, labor, and as our speaker will speak about, inequality, it seems an appropriate time to remember his life as someone who really believed that there were solutions if we could get people together in a room. So with that, I'll turn it back to Sharon, and thank you all for being here. This thing.
Okay. I love thinking about how happy we would have made John Dunlop with tonight's event. So Daron Acemoglu is an Institute Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so he is a neighbor. In 2024, as I'm sure you all know, Professor Acemoglu received the Sverige-Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, jointly with Simon Johnson and James A. Robinson, for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. He's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the British Academy, the American Philosophical Society, I mean, all the societies and academies. He's the author of 6 books, and many of his titles are eerily prescient and sadly highly relevant today. For example, The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, and Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, and that's just to name a few. As the Nobel Committee noted in its announcement of the award to Professor Acemoglu and his co-authors Simon Johnson and James Robinson, thanks to their groundbreaking research, we have a much deeper understanding of the root causes of why countries fail or succeed. We are thrilled to have Professor Acemoglu join us for the John Dunlop Lecture in particular during the Harvard Trade Union Program, because his work has lifted up the role of the labor movement as the kind of inclusive institution that plays an important role in leading nations to succeed, especially in a moment of technological change as we are experiencing today. In a time when the US labor movement is under more threat than I think at any time since the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, this is a critical message for policymakers and for all of us to understand. Supporting the labor movement, if you follow Professor Acemoglu's work, I think it is fair to say it's good for workers, their families, their communities, and for society. I found, on a personal note, I found Reading Power and Progress one of those aha reading moments. It has changed how I see the way that technology, labor, and economic policy fit together. And so I am so honored to introduce our 2025 Dunlop lecturer, Daron Acemoglu.
It's my true pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, David, for these introductory comments. And indeed, it's a great honor to deliver the John Dunlop lecture. And it's fantastic to have such a diverse audience. I'm going to talk without slides because I don't want to get lost in the technicalities. Is the slide open? Oh, just turned it off. Okay. Can you hear me better now? Yeah, perfect. I don't want to get lost in the technicalities because but I have a narrative that I'm going to share with you. Let me start with the bottom line. I think, as Sharon already indicated, this is a very difficult time for the labor movement, which I continue to believe is an important pillar of building shared prosperity in the future. But it's even more challenging than perhaps Sharon's comments may indicate, because what I'm going to argue is that the trade union movement, the labor movement, will need to change quite fundamentally in order to continue to have a meaningful impact on labor conditions, wages, and most importantly, technology, because of both social changes, but most importantly, because of economic changes. So in some sense, my message may be somewhat uncomfortable, and you may disagree with it, so that's why I'm not going to talk for very, very long to allow time for discussion and comments at the end. So let me first take about 10 minutes to lay the sort of the background scene, and then I'll explain to you why I believe that the labor movement needs to change, what direction this change needs to be, and why I believe that such a change is feasible, and if it's achieved, actually it could be very important in the current moment. And the current moment, of course, in addition to political issues, which we can touch upon as we go, is one defined by AI. I'm not an AI optimist. I don't think AI is going to suddenly transform everything or deliver tremendous productivity gains, but it is undoubtedly true that it will increasingly impact production relations. In particular, AI, if it proceeds along the trajectory that we have seen already, both traced by previous digital technologies and early indications of how artificial intelligence is being used and developed, it will increasingly be a tool for, first of all, automation, and secondly, worker control. By automation, I mean the use of machinery and algorithms for tasks previously performed by labor. So when you have weaving machines, power looms, take over tasks previously performed by handloom weavers, that is automation. When robots replace welders, that is automation. When AI takes over tasks from white-collar workers, or ultimately at some point, when combined with flexible robotics, it may also start influencing blue-collar and other manual tasks. That would be yet another phase of automation. By worker control, I mean the fact that with additional information processing and information collection, employers and managers can structure the work relationship in a way that can better, from their point of view, exercise, control, monitoring, and supervision over workers. That type of worker control is not necessarily bad, because sometimes it can improve efficiency. And the same is true for automation. So both of these are not just zero-sum activities. However, existing evidence suggests that both of these are going to be forces towards lower share of labor in value added. In particular, there is now a large body of work, some of which by myself, some of which by many other people in the United States and other countries, so it comes from a variety of industrialized nations, that automation is associated with declining share of the value added going to labor, and that makes a lot of theoretical as well as empirical sense. Theoretically, this is what you would expect because previously labor-intensive activities are now performed by capital, so overall role of capital is growing, and as a result, labor is being squeezed into fewer and fewer activities, which is the root cause of this labor share decline. In addition, automation could, but does not need to be associated with wage declines, even if it increases productivity, because it is reducing the share of labor. What gets paid to workers may actually go down. Hence, I think one important anchor to this discussion is that if technology, whatever technology it is, but especially if AI goes more and more in the direction of automation, it is not good news for workers overall. It will reduce their share in overall output, and it may even lead to stagnant or even declining wages. Now, some of that may be compensated if automation is super high productivity, but a lot of what we have seen over the last 40 years is that despite the promise of digital technologies, the productivity gains haven't been super large, so the distributional effects of automation have often dominated. So profits have increased, productivity has increased a little bit, and labor share and sometimes wages have declined. In addition, automation can also, and often tends to be, a driver of inequality. The reason for that is because the tasks that get automated, and hence the workers that are displaced, are not representative and equally distributed across all types of workers. And to the extent that they are the ones that suffer, they are the ones that already had lower pay or that suffer significant declines in their wages relative to other groups, it will be an amplifier of inequality. Now, I want to be upfront that there are people, quite knowledgeable people, who argue AI will be different. So there isn't much, well, there is some debate, of course, on anything in economics and social science, but I think there is general consensus that automation has been a major driver of increasing labor income inequality and inequality between capital and labor and between managers and workers over the last 30 years. But there is much greater controversy about what AI will do. Some people claim that because AI can automate cognitive tasks that are typically performed by higher pay workers, it will perhaps act as an equalizing force. I'm very skeptical. The evidence so far doesn't suggest that it is so, and moreover, even if at the end of the day, some of the higher paid white collar workers, such as accountants or some supervisory workers, are the ones who get displaced, they can often go and take jobs from lower paid workers, and inequality might still expand once all of these adjustments take place. Bottom line, automation is not going to be naturally a force that lifts all boats, or neither do I expect it to be a force towards greater labor income equality in the market. The same is largely true when you use AI as a control technology. When you monitor workers better, you don't need to pay them additional wages to motivate them. You can make some of the amenities less attractive for them. You can produce work practices that are much harder for them, as for example, the Amazon warehouse conditions signify. So while we know somewhat less about the empirical effects of this sort of monitoring or control technologies, at least on fairly strong a priori theoretical grounds, we should expect that they're not good news for workers either. Now, when you have the prospect of technological changes, or more generally organizational or social changes that could go against workers, of course, one great bulwark that could stop that in general is an organized labor movement. And we have seen in history several times where that has happened. But here comes my worst news. I don't think existing strategies are going to be effective in the current moment. And that is fundamentally because of the nature of the nature of the current technology and the direction in which technology is proceeding, as well as some of the background. So let me actually, the background, the weakness of the labor movement that has come already with deindustrialization, political and social changes, and the fact that the working class people are socially more divided, making union coalitions harder. That I think you are very well aware of. It's a very important context, and we can come back to it. But perhaps the point about automation that I'm going to make, simple though it may be, may not have been articulated or completely internalized by some of you. So let me make that very clear. So let's simplify what unions do. I am quite aware this is not what unions do in practice. It's much richer, but it is what we assume often what they do when we try to model them or in a simple way. So imagine that unions make wage demands, and employers then make other organizational choices. And imagine that you have a strong union that finally has been able to organize strongly in the face of all of these AI-related and threats, and it is in a position that it can actually demand and negotiate a much higher wage. What will happen? Perhaps for 1 or 2 years, employers may be forced to pay that wage. But if employers were already planning to automate work and they have access to available automation technologies that are at least capable of automating some of the tasks, even if not super productively, higher wages will just hasten the automation process. So if, as an employer, previously I was going to automate, say, 3 or 4% of tasks a year, once you make higher wage demands, now I will be tempted to do 6, 7, 8%. So any short-term gains that you achieve by higher wage demands will quickly be lost because of the faster automation response. So that would, of course, put the labor movement between a rock and a hard place. Either you don't push for wages, in which case, what's the great use of the labor movement? You just take all of the automation and other pressures for lower wages coming from AI and other social processes as given, or you make the high wage demand, and for a while you get higher wages for your members, but ultimately you lead to faster automation and displacement of workers from the tasks that they were previously specializing in. But what I'm going to argue is that though this situation sounds bleak, there is a way out of this conundrum. And that way can be first appreciated by taking a step back. And in fact, I'm going to take a step back in 2 dimensions. First, I'm going to tell you about what I think AI, in general, other technologies, but especially AI and modern digital technologies can do beyond automation. And second, I'm going to discuss different types of bargaining strategies, again, at a simplified level, that unions can adopt. And then I'm going to put these two pieces together and try to articulate this different direction of unionism or labor movement. So the first point I want to make is that AI is not necessarily an automation technology. I started by asserting, and again, we can have a debate on this, and there are some people in the AI industry who disagree with many of the things I will say. But I first started by characterizing current AI as being targeting largely automation type activities. That is my assessment of where the industry is going right now. It is not a statement about what AI is in theory capable of doing. AI is an information technology. It is a way of better representing, better acquiring, better organizing information, which sometimes can be used for generating certain things like generating text. It can be used for performing some tasks combined with other processes. But it can also be used for providing information to workers. Providing information to workers is one part, but a very important part of what you would call increasing the marginal productivity of workers or increasing the contribution of workers to the production process. Every production process has a need for adapting to conditions. Those conditions may be, for example, for an electrician dealing with a problem that is slowing down or creating malfunction, and it may be a problem that they haven't encountered before or for which they don't have any training. So the better the information they have, the better they can deal with that problem. Even along the most sort of pre-organized assembly line, there are a whole host of adaptations that need to be made. A lot of that is informational. But a very important additional role of information is that if it's provided in the right way, it can also enable workers to be better trained to perform more sophisticated tasks and to perform new tasks. So for example, for an electrician, it's not only help the electrician identify existing problems that they know how to deal with, but additional information make them better at identifying. But it can also enable electrician to deal with more sophisticated problems, because now with that additional information, they can understand the problem, or they can use that for in real-time training, and also expand the set of tasks that they are able to deal with, at least in principle. What is true for electricians is true for plumbers, is true for welders, is true for technicians, is true for nurses, educators, and all sorts of occupations. So if AI is used as an information technology, it can have a very different impact than just automation. That impact could, in principle, again, it's an empirical question, it will be a case-by-case question, could in fact be more productivity enhancing than just automation. The calculus would be something like this. If you automate, what are you going to do? Even under the best case scenarios, by automating, say, a few tasks, so I gave the example of 3% of the tasks being automated, how much cost savings can you do with that automation? Well, estimates range, but 15%, 20% cost saving is huge. But when applied to 3%, that's hardly going to be a revolutionary productivity change. If, on the other hand, by providing this better information, you can make all of your workers 1 or 2% more productive, that's equivalent. So if you can make them 5% more productive, that's actually much larger than just getting a little bit of cost savings on a few items. So in principle, this providing information, better information, and enhancing the contribution of workers to the production process could be more productivity enhancing than other paths of AI. It would That's a question mark. It may or may not be. It will depend. For some processes, it will be yes. For some other processes, it will be no. But it will always be better for workers. In fact, if you can indeed enable workers to perform new tasks, rather than reduce the labor share of value added, it will tend to increase the labor share of value added because you're creating new things workers can do. So this new task path is very pro-labor. But there is another sense in which this whole labor enhancement is actually quite dependent on communication with workers as well, which needs to be taken into account. So one of the reasons that I think sometimes is documented and sometimes is conjectured as a reason why often digital technologies have had disappointing productivity implications relative to expectations is that they have not completely understood or leveraged the tacit information that workers employ on the job. So, in other words, if you apply AI, not just as an automation technology, but also an automation technology developed in Silicon Valley and then applied across all sorts of industries, one thing that's going to get missed is what are all the subtleties and the difficulties that workers did day in and day out actually deal with in the context of their jobs. So another productivity enhancing thing is to actually develop both the technologies in the first place and the adoption and use of these technologies, incorporating more on-the-ground tacit knowledge. And what that has in common with the new tasks that I have mentioned, it again needs labor. So new tasks need labor because they are going to be labor intensive. It's the things that labor is going to do in more sophisticated or better form. But if you want whatever use of AI to actually incorporate all that tacit knowledge that people have built or with experiential learning, sometimes over generations, that also again needs labor. So therefore, summary, there are a multitude of ways in which AI could be used. It could indeed be used as a control device and as an automation technology, which are not going to be good for labor, but it has more pro-labor ways of being developed. Before I go to now revisiting what it is that the labor movement could do, let me also conjecture, because here I use the word conjecture because I don't think there is any certainty here. If indeed, I'm going to conjecture an answer to this following question. If indeed there are more pro-worker and potentially productive users of digital technologies and AI, why aren't we seeing more of them? Why are we seeing an emphasis on automation? And I think that's important to recognize because it's going to be part of the background to which I'm going to be referring in a second. My answer to that, again, somewhat of a conjecture because we don't have hard evidence to prove that those are the main factors, is a combination of two things. One is that the tech sector itself, both for ideological and business model reasons, has focused much more on automation. Business model because they know how to make money from selling software for automation. Creating technologies that are helpful to workers and then monetizing them is not a very easy thing, and that's not something that they have invested in. And ideologically because I think the tech sector has often prioritized sort of automation-like things because of the way that it thinks about technology, the way that it has approached technology. And we can talk about this, not to make my comments much longer than necessary. I'm bracketing this, so if you're curious about why I think there is this ideological bias and you want to think a little bit more about these business models, I'm more than happy to get much more into depth on this in the Q&A session. Second, in addition to what is the tech side, there is also the management side of the firms that are using these technologies. There is, in general, of course, every incentive for a manager to adopt the technology in a way that increases productivity. So if I had one automation way of using the technology and enhancing new tasks or more sophisticated tasks for workers, and the latter was more productive, and Isabel was the manager who wanted to maximize profits, she would choose the latter. But there's an exception to that that's very important. If Isabel thinks that she is locked into a bad industrial relations and she doesn't want to deal with workers, then there is an additional reason for automation. Because by doing automation, A, you're sidelining workers, and B, you're weakening the workers. So, in fact, the wrong type of industrial relations would create an additional bias towards automation, this time not coming from the technology developers, but from technology users. So now with this background, let me go onto my discussion of what it is that, how is it that labor could negotiate? And I'm going to do that first at the level of just what instruments, and then take one step back and talk about softer things like trust, communication, etc. So what I described earlier on, which is unions or labor representatives choose wages, and then employers make all the other decisions, of course, is not reality. In reality, negotiations take place over wages, working conditions, sometimes employment, sometimes even technology and how technology is used. The question is one of balance. How much do you prioritize wage and giving more of the discretion on the other things to the management, versus how much do you prioritize the whole bundle and try to reach an agreement on that whole bundle? So if it's the negotiation is mostly about wage, the conundrum I have pointed out cannot be avoided. But the more the labor negotiations shift towards the whole bundle, the situation becomes very different. So in particular, imagine instead of asking for a 20% raise and nothing else, which would trigger this additional automation response, I demand a 10% raise, but also that we're going to try to make an effort to reduce automation and instead use existing technologies in a way to increase productivity via other means. If indeed those demands are feasible, and again we come back to, is that really a productivity enhancing way of using the technology, which I have argued yes, but it will be a case-by-case issue. If indeed that's the case, if indeed there is that trust that that can be made to work, now we have opened a completely new sort of avenue for the labor movement. But what does this require? First of all, it requires absolutely a very high degree of sophistication by the labor movement on technology. If the labor movement doesn't understand technology, it couldn't possibly try to steer the negotiations towards a direction in which, rather than automation, something else that's productivity enhancing is done by the use of this technology. It requires that the labor movement, in communication with its membership and with the right communication with the management, leverages this tacit knowledge. So if the tacit knowledge is in fact so important, that's actually a very critical part of the strength of the labor movement, not just being able to demand high wages, but actually leveraging that tacit knowledge. And then third, it also requires the right type of communication and trust between the management and the labor movement. If somehow the management, just like my caricature of Isabel earlier on as the bad manager, is convinced that there is no way but weaken the labor movement, they're not going to be open to these kinds of deals. Now, this scenario is, of course, much harder in some places like the UK and the US, where employment, the industrial relations between management and labor representatives have been much more conflictual. They have been much more conflictual, I think, in part because the employment law in the United States that forces agreements at the business unit have actually pushed all of these more towards the first type of caricature that I said, more on the wage and not more on these more holistic things. And in fact, if you want examples of labor negotiations that go more towards the trying to cover both wages and employment and the use of technology, the examples will have to come from continental Europe. Germany, where, you know, labor's representation in the boardroom, work councils and unions, all sort of combinations of these have sometimes worked towards that. Sometimes because, you know, not always. Alex can tell us more about that. But, you know, for instance, especially when conditions were good in the car industry, there is a lot of evidence that when robots were introduced and American car makers just lay off the workers, German car makers retrain these employees for more technical tasks. And you have similar things in the Nordic negotiations as well. The fact that there is both greater trust in some of these and also more of an industry level element that makes these technology negotiations easier, of course, has to be noted. In the US, the evidence doesn't suggest, at least, that achieving this is going to be harder, but I don't think it's impossible. I think the US is characterized by more adversarial labor relations. So, for example, a paper written by two of my PhD students a couple of years ago, Sean Wang and Sami Yang, found that when a plant newly unionizes, recognizes a union, rather than increasing wages, it actually often reduces wages or reduces labor earnings. The reason is because in many cases, management is so intent on avoiding unionization that they tend to either reduce employment by a large amount or in fact even shut down the plant, even though that's actually supposed to be illegal. So the response of managers is so conflictual that it actually often nullifies newly unionized plants' ability to negotiate on these things. So if you're in a situation like that, of course, it's going to make labor's life harder. So what does it then take for a labor movement to actually go in this direction? I would say, in addition to what I already emphasized, much greater understanding of technology, and that's something that is developing very slowly, albeit it's developing. For example, the fact that AFL-CIO has opened a technology institute is very encouraging, but I don't think it's a general understanding across all of the labor organizations that this is an imperative. Second, in some sense, labor unions need to have the right sort of carrot and stick strategy. Stick is always the same. Labor union has to be strong enough that if their demands are unreasonably rejected, they could take actions that are costly for the organization, such as slowing down work or strikes. So those are not different. Of course, the room for that is going to be different in different administration and the different conditions of unionization, but the stick is there. But I think the labor movement would be much more powerful in this age of AI if the stick is off the equilibrium path, meaning that the threat of the stick is there, but actually what also motivates the negotiation is the carrot. And what is the carrot? I think the carrot has to be that at the end, the path that's found in how to use this technology is profitable for the firm as well. So in some sense, a very traditional model of the union would be, okay, there is a pie. That pie is made by the past investments, et cetera, of the firm, and then the big thing is dividing that pie. If that's the case, that's a zero-sum thing. I win, you lose. So the only way the labor movement can win is by the profits of the firm coming down. So, but the issue of steering the technology towards a different way means that the labor movement actually has to be an agent of pushing firms towards directions that are not so bad for the firm. Because otherwise, again, even with a pretty hefty stick, the option of, okay, forget the labor movement, we're just going to go down the automation path is a big threat for, or a big attractive point for employers. So in some sense, what I'm suggesting may sound completely counterintuitive. So the unions have to be even more active in the direction of technology than management. Perhaps that's a pipe dream, but if it's going to be a reality, it requires the right type of approach and much greater level of understanding of both the tacit knowledge that's going to be useful for firms and how technology can be leveraged. Now, some of you may find this direction very Pollyanna-ish or unrealistic or very difficult to achieve. I'm not claiming that it's easy to achieve, but what I'm claiming, again, on which we may disagree, is that the alternative is very dire. Neither just asking for higher wages or saying no to automation are viable when Silicon Valley produces more and more automation directions, AI investment more and more expands, and managers are more and more happy to leverage these technologies, even when they're not super productivity enhancing, in order to just reduce their reliance on labor. The real prize, however, in my opinion, and here again, AFL-CIO's, although symbolic relationship with Microsoft is intriguing, is that once this process starts, some of the incentives can then get transmitted from the organizations that are using the technology to technology producers. Once there are sufficient demonstration effects that actually the right kind of technologies can be used in order to make workers more productive, and the labor movement and management can reach agreements on this, that would propose potential ways of monetizing such technologies more broadly for the technology industry, so it could have ripple effects that could potentially be even more important. But again, you see the responsibility here on the negotiations between labor and capital as the trigger for this change, of course, means very heavy burden on the shoulders of the labor movement. So I think, therefore, what I'm suggesting is a completely different model of the labor movement with much greater responsibility and a much greater understanding of technology, but also a more explicit strategy of trying to find just the right kind of negotiations with management that, I hate that term, but is somehow win-win for both the labor movement and the firm, as a potentially transformative change that could then have a variety of other beneficial effects. Okay, I think I have summarized my perspective. I'm sure there are a lot of reactions and comments on this, which I now welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question about how you think about the responsibility of intellectuals and communicating with the broader public. Because one thing I've noticed about you, you have books like The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. There's a lot of sophisticated, intricate mathematics that's very different than our beloved Barrington Moore, who had an aversion, I think, to quantification. But the striking thing about your book, I find, is how easily it conveys knowledge to the general public. And, you seem to be able to work in both worlds, and most intellectuals in academia seem incapable of doing that. So I'd just like to hear a few of your thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I deeply believe in the importance of communicating these ideas to the broad, interested public. And that's why a lot of my books, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy being an exception, are written for the broader public without mathematics or quantitative heavy-handedness. But I also believe in the importance of the quantitative method in social science. So on the side, I want to develop both of them. When it comes to issues like the one we are talking about today, actually, broader outreach, I believe, is really important, because I think the labor movement's strength always relies also partly on society's understanding of whether the labor movement is playing a useful role or not. And charting a course that is potentially useful both for workers' wages, but also potentially productivity enhancing adaptations at the work level, if that's a sort of a feasible thing, and communicating to the public that that's what the labor movement is trying to do or could do, actually could be an important part of that strength.
Thank you. Is it on? Thank you. An amazing talk. And I think this requires you to open up the part you bracketed in your talk. Since it is the Dunlop lecture, I will cite two moments in labor history that make me pessimistic about taking the option you're describing, the win-win option. In the post-war period, Walter Reuther wanted to move the automobile industry in a very different direction and put on the table the auto workers not just negotiating price, but also being involved in product selection and pricing of the final vehicle, and was summarily thrown out of the room, essentially. In the 1990s, the two garment workers' unions were very interested in moving production in order to enhance responsiveness in this country towards modular systems of production and innovative ways of actually minimizing risk and inventories. And again, they were shut down by the major companies. So I guess the question is, there is, in your bracketed part, I suspect there is a part of this about something that's embedded that makes it very difficult to toggle to the solution that you're describing.
Absolutely. I think there are conditions in the US context that make this harder, and given the leadership that US has, at least apparently in AI, I think these changes will have to take place in the United States. It can't be just in Sweden, Norway, and Germany. So I am very, very appreciative of your comment, because I do not think that this is easy. And that's why it does require a very broad change in the labor movement and the right kind of communication, and whether you can actually find receptive employers and managers. Some managers may, in the US context, for ideological and other reasons, may be so anti-labor that this is, at least at first, completely impossible with them. But whether you can find enough of the managers and businesses where this could be done. And again, I think although symbolic, what AFL-CIO leadership is trying to do is perhaps can be interpreted in this light. Now, I think the things that I bracketed mostly were about the tech industry. Now, I don't think those are going to be very easy to change. So there were many moments in tech history where there were viable paths which could have been more pro-worker. But oftentimes they weren't taken, and for reasons nothing to do with the labor movement. They weren't taken mostly either because of ideological reasons, that most people were more interested in developing, very automated systems, or they were not taken because larger organizations such as IBM, then Microsoft, et cetera, had business models that they didn't know how to adapt to other things. So they serving larger corporations with standardized software, which tends to be much more lean towards automation, were the choices. But the other bracketed part, in some sense, is what the business managers do in the United States. I found, for example, the paper by my students that I mentioned so depressing, but it is indicative of the conditions that we are living in. But there are demonstration effects from possible better solutions that could be established. Perhaps some of them would need to be done at smaller companies first, and then the right lessons need to be drawn. The language of the labor movement might need to be more industry specific, finding just the right sort of way of appealing to the industry. And so, I mean, in all of these, you can say your proposed solution is so unfair. It's putting all of the onus on the labor movement to do all of these things, but that is the reality we're living in, unfortunately.
I was wondering about when you said that like when we see a trend that there's like less wage when there's a student when there's a union in the factory. Because the country I come from, India, we see like the states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, there have been like unions there, and we also saw a trend where there was like less wages. Is it some sort of
Is that trend where
in India in
in Gujarat you said?
Yes, in Gujarat and Maharashtra, where we see a trend like there are less wages when there are unions in the factory. Is it some sort of a safety valve, like they use it?
I see. Well, I think I don't know enough of the Indian context, but I have heard some of my Indian colleagues, talk about, for example, in places like West Bengal, where the militancy may have run ahead of economic reasons, which could be one of the factors. I don't know about Gujarat, but there is a lot of talk of like more communist unions, for example, taking actions that are very visible, but then don't actually lead to the kinds of outcomes. So I think there are going to be many different conditions on the ground in different countries, and I'm not enough sufficiently informed about the Indian context to be able to say.
Thank you so much for this very insightful talk. Your point on the importance of the tacit knowledge of workers is very well taken. It's a critical source of power that they have. And you're also right to insist that that's an important carrot, because they can leverage that as it can lead to increased productivity. Now, if we stay in the mindset of a zero-sum game, the moment they share that tacit knowledge and information, especially in the world of AI, the risk is that they lose that critical source of power. Unless the governance of the firm has changed, and you gave the examples, and I understand that in the context of the United States it's complicated, because then that power sharing makes sense, because we can together, if we have a seat at the table, discuss these things.
That's right.
So I guess my question is, would it be possible for the labor movement to leverage that critical source of power in a constructive way for all of the stakeholders without changing the governance of the firm?
great question, and I don't know the answer to that. The only thing I would say is that if there is a very strong automation drive, that tacit knowledge is never going to be effectively used anyway. Because the way that you do the automation oftentimes is ignore a lot of the details, where the tacit knowledge lives, etc. So the tacit knowledge is even more useful when the issue is, can we try to make the workers more productive? So that is the reason why I think the concern that you raise, which is that once the tacit knowledge is shared, then will there be a reneging, is valid, but I wouldn't think it's the most the biggest threat, but it remains to be seen. Now, the broader question, of course, with or without the tacit knowledge, different governance structures would make this very difficult. So, for example, if from the beginning somehow you declared constitutionally or via labor law that the labor movement was a veto player, of course, some agreements would be much easier. But that, of course, is not the situation in the United States. It's not even the situation in the most labor-friendly places.
Just here, yeah.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I come from Australia, a union representing around 250,000 retail and fast food workers. And so I'm sort of interested to pick up on something that Jack sort of spoke about, which is, having clear conversations with the general public, including our members who are retail workers. I find a lot of what you've said really interesting. The challenge for us, of course, is, and I also think that there is an unfairness in the labor movement having to do the heavy lifting in this space. With that said, we're willing to do it. But I think the challenge is for us as labor leaders, like my members in retail, all they associate with AI and automation is displacement of their jobs, increased work intensity, reduced hours, all of those things then leading to increased occupational violence. Like, they only see this as a net negative. So if it's a space we're going to be in, which I think we have to be, and you're right in saying that, and I know you're not here to give us political advice, but how do you think we can approach that with, our rank and file members to help them understand that we need to be in this space and shaping it in a way that's in their interests? Because I think their current frame of mind on this is that there's only downside and there's no upside. And of course, we've got to reshape that, but I think that's a real challenge for us.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is a great question. And a few examples of unions doing a little bit of what I mentioned starts by some union leaders recognizing the opportunities. And in the retail, I don't know what they are, actually. I gave you some examples from electricians, electrical workers, plumbers, etc. But for retail workers, it's not something I studied. So, but recognizing that, but also communicating with the leadership, with the rank and file, because they need to believe in it as well. And union leaders who have the right reputation is very important, who have the right communication strategy is very important, and they need to communicate both with management and with their members. But I think increasingly the members are seeing what the status quo ante is leading to, so perhaps that may become easier because they understand that the current situation may become untenable, or is untenable. Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I have a question, which is, why did actually Germany develop these kind of institutions? Because it seems to me that it's crucial to understand the historical origins of these institutions in order to be able to replicate them. And I would suggest, I have a provocative hypothesis, which is it casual that Germany, Sweden, and the social democracies were on the front line in the Cold War? Because a pessimist take on why these institutions developed is because workers had a very strong off the equilibrium path stick, which was siding with the Soviet Union. And so this created more incentive on part of managers to comply.
It is not a crazy hypothesis, but I don't think it's the correct one. So in Scandinavia, these institutions developed actually before the war, and they developed for a variety of reasons. But a very important part of that was actually the fact that the union movement and also the Social Democratic or the Workers' Party had rejected communism, especially in Sweden and also in Denmark. Norway is a bit more complicated. And that sort of allowed them to better negotiate with employers. Now, whether there was some other historical reasons in the Swedish context that made the corporatist model easier to develop, we can talk about some cultural things, etc. But it's this combination that they, the businesses would trust them because they didn't have like an agenda of revolution. In the German context, my understanding, Alex could tell us more, is that they actually are a post-World War II phenomenon. And it might have been partly because of social peace that some of these things were introduced, including the training system. But also the training system has some parts of these professional associations that goes back to much earlier times, as far as I understand. But I read about the origins of the training apprenticeship system and some of these things very long time ago, and now some of these details are blurry. But it's a great question, and I think it's something that we need to understand. But my sense is that in line with the overall strategy that I am suggesting, although again, in principle, one could have hypothesized either way. You could say like the real threat of communism may make employers more amenable to the table. I think sort of communist unions haven't been as effective as social democratic unions in this, and that might have some lessons, but there may be some variety across countries that. So one case in point is France, for example, which has, in some sense, as strong a labor movement as Germany, but it hasn't achieved the same thing. It's partly because French unions haven't sort of come to the table in the same way that the Scandinavian or Nordic and the German unions have. But again, I think the details need to be understood much better than I know them.
So on that last question, I think, and Isabel can probably correct me, but I think part of at least the workers on corporate boards in Germany was a post-war development that was actually pushed by Americans because of a distrust of German industrial leaders who had not behaved well during the war. But my question is, in your conception of how to move forward in the productivity enhancing AI regime, the party that you haven't mentioned is the role of the government. Now, it's obviously a difficult conversation to have right now in this country, but thinking even about regulation of AI in states, and particularly in California, like what could help so that the labor movement doesn't have to carry the whole burden of making this shift on its own, whether it's tax credits, which we've done in the past to like during recessions where we provide tax credits for employers who don't lay off people but make part-time work. Are there any?
Well, absolutely. So many things. Thank you very much for bringing that up, Sharon. That's an oversight on my part, in part because I don't think this is a very active channel that you can hope for the next 4 years. But there are so many things the government could do if they wanted to, and certainly no government has even attempted to do in recent periods. So one of them is you take some of the more abusive use of AI, for example, in work scheduling or monitoring. That's going to take some of the threat points from the labor side off, or from the employer side off. If you somehow via subsidies or regulations encourage a different direction of AI so that some companies invest in more sort of productivity enhancing or pro-worker AI, that would of course be very, very important. If you look at the US tax system, and this is actually not so different in most industrialized nations, my calculations are that if as a company you hire a worker, the joint tax burden at the margin of you and the employee together with payroll taxes, health care contributions, federal taxes, and other things, if you add them, it's about 30%. If instead you hire a machine to do the same thing, it's about 5% or less. So there's a huge incentive at the margin for firms to use machines or algorithms instead of labor. So if you get rid of that, that's also going to level the playing field. So there are many things the government could do, and of course the Nordic example that we were mentioning, the government is also part of the negotiations, at least for some parts of the industry, parts of it, and that could also play an important role. Even though Biden was a somewhat more pro-worker president, none of these were even considered under Biden, so I don't think they're going to be considered in the next 4 years. And I don't know. Sorry?
Maybe in the States.
Maybe in the States, maybe, but not the fiscal part, no. And changing the direction of AI, perhaps California is powerful enough to do that, but no other state.
So I was similarly was surprised in your remarks not to hear more about the role of the state, which strikes me as a sort of key actor. But in particular, you rightfully and importantly bring attention to management's preference for labor displacing and labor degrading technologies over labor complementing technologies, even when they're not especially productivity enhancing. And I mean, so it strikes me that a big part of the problem here, even when you establish different sets of bargaining conditions, is that there actually aren't AI enterprise products that are labor complementing. And so I'm trying to sort of understand in your recommendations the idea that through the bargaining process, that it's sustained long enough to increase demand within the R&D cycle, so that these technologies emerge over some period of time. Because and it gets also to the question of sort of where state policy falls within this, because it strikes me as such a crucial missing link if the technologies are not available during periods of bargaining.
So, I mean, I think your question has many parts, but let me focus on the last part, which is, my presumption here is that even existing technologies can be used in many different ways. So, the enterprise solutions, for example, can be used more for automation, or you could try to use them in a way that's less automation and work more with the unions. But ideally, all of this applies with much greater force if on the table we have both more pro-worker technologies that have been developed, for example, just exactly the kind of domain-specific expertise giving things that could help electricians or blue-collar workers. They're not on the table, but that's where I was referring to, perhaps in a very optimistic way, the demonstration effects. If there are companies that use these technologies or have a demand for these kinds of technologies, perhaps that can then be a factor in some entrepreneurs to develop these kinds of technologies. In many of the examples, by the way, that I have given, like not all, but some type of technology to help electricians, some type of technology to help nurses, some type of technology to help educators. These are not like completely technologically very challenging problems. So there are small companies that are working on similar issues, but they're very small, and most of them don't even develop a prototype because they're not at the forefront. So it is possible that there could be this kind of leveraging effect, but again, it's optimistic. And yeah, of course, if the state helps, it's great. But if the state really wanted it, it could do many things that we haven't seen it do. So that's why I wasn't. That's true. That's true. That's true. But that's why this says expertise. So the more the labor movement builds expertise, so the more it says, look, this is the kinds of things that our workers are struggling on the factory floor. Give us this technology and they're going to be more productive. That could be the kind of communication that could be effective.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking talk. I really think you're making a powerful point in calling for these labor leaders in the room to really care for the content of the technology, the finality that the technology is pursuing in the context of the firm. But you are also an expert in the conditions enabling democracies to flourish, right? And in your work with Simon Johnson, you are using that term extractivist to speak about institutional arrangements that are actually debasing the possibility for democracies to flourish. So my question is, would you consider to use that term to describe the current corporate structure arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a gray area that, it looks more and more that way. So in particular, it's the practice rather than the institutions that we have to first start from. So if indeed employers are more and more prioritizing defeating the labor movement, that very much acts like an extractive institution. Now, this is a conversation that you and I had at some point related to workplace democracy. So my view is not the same as yours. So I think you can have broadly inclusive institutions that don't necessarily have workplace democracy if decisions are still made by managers, but unions are strong and the right kind of negotiations are enabled by laws and other things, that could work. But of course, some degree of workplace democracy could help in that. But then too much workplace democracy might create other problems, especially when firms are, need to be sort of adaptive to other things. So I think it's going to be a case-by-case situation of what sort of governance structures work for different industries. And I think that's one of the very interesting things, again, I'm not sure by design, but emerged in the German system because of the dual structure, that there is greater flexibility. Sometimes the industry level bargains matter more, sometimes the work councils or the labor in the boardroom matters more. So something like that might provide the right kind of flexibility for different industries.
So,
Great, excellent.
yes, building on the workplace democracy theme, though, not going to let that one go. A co-chair of this program, Richard Freeman, who's a friend of yours and
course.
mine, I'm sure, 10 years ago, before AI was on the horizon, talked about robots. We were having discussions about this, and he said, well, workers need to own the robots. Labor needs to own the robots. And I think there's a sort of an overarching question here about how we can make what is rational for companies also rational for workers. And that means bringing workers into the rational structure of the firm in some form or fashion, and then figuring out what the role of unions can be, and it's a very strong one, when firms are democratic, when they're owned by managers and workers alike. Yeah. I'm wondering this is what I've been teaching here at the program. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would distinguish between control rights and ownership rights. I think control rights to me are more important. So let me again go back to the German context. There is very interesting work by Simon Jäger and Benjamin Schäufer, both in Germany and actually in Finland, where they show that when there is labor in the boardroom, firms actually adopt more robots. More robots. So similar firms where workers are in the boardroom are better at are faster at adopting robots, and they don't pay any higher or lower wages. So there seems to be no wage effect. So the interpretation that they have, which I think is quite reasonable, is that once workers are in the boardroom, they get the communication of why and how the robots should be used, and they're part of the negotiation. So they make sure, okay, if the robots are important, let's adopt them, but let's not cut wages. So that's about control rights. So I think that works, and that's again, that's somewhere between workplace, in that gray area between workplace democracy, where everything is determined democratically, versus everything is determined by the CEO, somewhere in between. Now, imagine that the control rights are again with a very heavy-handed manager, but robots are owned by workers. What would that do? Well, I think that's a special case of a more general thing. Is, can we have, labor becoming more and more eliminated from tasks, but then we find other mechanisms for compensating laborers. In the extreme case, what Silicon Valley likes, like a universal basic income, but we could do it through a fund where that fund owns AI or robots or something like that. Of course, that's better than nothing, but it's not my preferred solution. It's not my preferred solution for 3 reasons. The first one is that I actually don't believe that that's a viable solution. Meaning that the political economy of it would be very fragile. So today, with much lower rates of taxation, people like Elon Musk or Sam Altman are not very keen on sharing their gains with workers. Now, if you actually say, we're going to take 50% of your income or wealth, and we're going to redistribute that, that's going to be a much more fragile thing. And given the way that politics is going everywhere, that's not going to be very easy to do. More importantly, I think I also see that as a defeatist solution, meaning that if indeed I'm right, which I may be wrong, that there is a direction of AI and workplace relations that actually elevates labor, that's actually better, because then labor contributes to work and productivity may be better, or maybe at least as well. And labor becomes very essential for production, and maybe it becomes an essential via its social role. I think that's a better outcome. And then third, and perhaps the most importantly, I think even if we could make the political economy work, that would be a very dystopian outcome. So imagine will be a situation where 2, 3, 4, 10% of the population is making all the important decisions, is earning all the money as the designers of the robots or the AI or the top managers, and everybody else is getting crumbs via either their ownership of robots or a universal basic income. So that would be a very unequal society via status, and one in which 90% of people feel like they're not contributing, and I think that would be a very dystopian outcome. Now, if we can do nothing else, I'll take that relative to a hugely unequal society, but hopefully we can do something better.
Well, you pretty much touched on a portion of my question, but earlier you touched on a little bit about the amplified inequality and that white collar workers are shifting to some blue collar jobs. And working in unions, and dealing with negotiations, of course, that's the first thing that people look at is the money, right? So I totally agree with as technology develops, that you develop the employee as well. But if we leave the money on the table, does that further increase that amplified inequity of the wage structure?
Absolutely, if you really leave money on the table. So the ideal would be you find the right kind of bargain. Again, I understand this is a bit of a big ask or a pipe dream, but you find just the right arrangement that is good enough for the firm, but it doesn't leave an excessive amount of money on the table, so you actually pay higher wages to workers as well. So if there is really a way in which we can increase productivity by making workers more productive, and firms accept that, they'll benefit from it as well. So they'll be willing to pay higher wages without unions just leaving too much money on the table.
Thank you very much for this talk. I was just building a bit on the question here, and then also something that Sharon shared. I was wondering, so you mentioned the R&D direction of labor learning more about technology and forcing, kind of creating more options or technology complementary. I was thinking about what Sharon mentioned about how in Germany, they were forced to adapt because they installed these worker councils because they were afraid of subversion, et cetera. So it seems like when they already have worker presence and worker power, then things change. So I was wondering, what do you think about the other side of the argument that what if we just increase labor power and unionization, and then now you have more entrenched labor in the workforce, so the technologies and the companies have to innovate to make more labor complementary technology? Like, why is the kind of onus on labor? What about this other approach of the onus is on tech, and then actually incentivizes them through a combination of government policies as well. Now tech has to really innovate to make more labor complementary work.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think absolutely you do need the stick. So that's what I was referring. So some degree of unionization, and the more the merrier, that's very important. But the stick by itself, I was trying to say, may not be enough, because even if you temporarily increase unionization, and all you do is use that for asking for higher wages, but you leave the automation path, that increase in unionization is not sustainable, because work will get automated and that will take a hit on unionization as well. So that's why you need a stick. Unions need to be strong. If they're so weak that they can't even come to the negotiation table, that's not going to work. You need a stick, but you need the carrot of just what we were just talking about. Finding the right direction has to do some of the work as well.
Well, everybody, please join me in a big thank you for this amazing evening.